thank you everybody for being here this evening. I know for most of you, tearing yourself away from the Republican National Convention has been quite a sacrifice. And so we do note that. We're the oldest independent bookstore in Los Angeles, been in business since 1940. And among the things that makes it worthwhile is to have the opportunity to have interesting writers in conversation with each other on subject matters that I, as one of the owners, find interesting. I hope you will as well. But this is one I've been particularly focused on and looking forward to. We're going to discuss this evening two books. Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 1960s. Jon Wiener is the author of that. And The Contested Murder of Latasha Harlins, Brenda Stevenson is the author of that. Jon is a now emeritus professor at UCI. Dr. Stevenson is a professor at UCLA in the history department. And what I think you will find is there is almost no subject matter that is quite as timely as that which we will be discussing tonight. Jon's books covers the 1960s, and a substantial part of it is about policing, race, redlining, the treatment of the African-American community, the growth of the Chicano movement, what it means to be Asian American in Los Angeles, the coalition between the Tom Bradley and West Side liberals, and all centered around lots of political changes, as well as the Watts riots, or depending upon your, I think, political philosophy, the Watts uprising, and then a lot of discussion about the Watts Renaissance. Professor Stevenson's book is about the Latasha Harlins tragic murder, and perhaps equally more tragic trial and sentence that was imposed. And it's in many respects, a kind of biography of the key participants, focused a lot on their ethnic racial backgrounds and how that all came together. And what I've been saying to friends as I describe reading these two books over the last couple of weeks is that it answers the question of how we got here, because it is impossible to read Jon's book, think about today, and not go through the experience documented by Brenda in her book. And so I look forward greatly to this conversation, because I really would like to figure out not only how we got here, but how we're going to get out of here. So Jon, let me, I know you wanted to be the first one to speak, and so I'm going to honor that request, and then I will stand back. We'll probably do this for about 40 or so minutes. People will have questions, and we'll go from there. So Jon, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Bert. It's it's great to be part of Chevaliers, and thanks to Kelsey for running the show here, and special thanks to Brenda Stevenson. She has written a fantastic book, and I really want to talk to her about it a little later in the hour. But first of all, Brenda and her husband are famous as collectors of African masks. And Brenda, there is a beautiful mask behind you. What is it?
Well, this is a mask from West and Central Africa, and my husband and I have been collecting for the last quarter century. And it's something that we took up when we moved to Los Angeles. We were a young couple, and we could not afford to buy art, but they had a wonderful, wonderful African art show every summer in LA, right over at one of the high schools. And so we started going, and we started buying things, and then we just got more and more and more invested in it. So it's been great. It's one of the things you can do in Los Angeles. is buy art and affordable art too, until it's not, and then you move on to do something else. So it's one of the great treasures of this city. But
Well,
okay, I want to get started though with talking to you about your new book. Okay,
okay.
let me talk a little bit about my book. My book is older, all right, and so I want everyone to know how wonderful your book, The Tome, is. It is
Thank
a
you.
giant book, but it is so readable. I mean, I just started reading and I just went from topic to topic to topic to topic, and I learned so much. So I want to talk a little bit about, I want to begin by talking about your book and how you and Mike came to write this fantastic book that we'll be reading for a very long time.
Well, thank you for those kind words. Um, you know, my co-author, Mike Davis, I should say he's sorry he couldn't be here. He's trying to write another book. He's on a deadline for that. He's sort of moved on from the 60s, but this is really Mike Davis's idea. This book was Mike Davis's idea a long time ago. I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. He wrote a wonderful essay on the Sunset Strip riots of 1965 and 1966. And it was published in a journal. You as a historian might even have heard of this journal. It's a Canadian bilingual labor history journal called Labor Le Travail. I don't know, maybe your subscription has lapsed by now, but that's where he published this piece. And you know, a few of us read it and thought it was wonderful and encouraged him, you know, you should do more of this. And so at that point, he kind of sketched out a rough idea about what would a book on LA in the 60s cover. But he had a lot of other things, you know, he's a busy man. He's written, you know, a dozen, 15 books, all for sale at Chevalier's, I believe. And then about 5 years ago, and I was waiting patiently for this book. When is Mike going to finish his book on LA in the 60s? All we have is this one chapter. And about 5 years ago, he emailed me and said, would I co-author it with him because he thought he would never be able to finish it. He had too much else going on. And I said, I'd love to do it. I'd love to do it. But how are we going to divide this up? And we had a very logical division of labor. The basic conception of the book is there's a spine, a through line, which is the chronological history of Black and Chicano political organizing. The whole book is kind of a history from below of ordinary people's lives and struggles. Our heroes live in the flatlands of Los Angeles, we say. The center of it is the Black movement of the early 60s, then Watts as the kind of linchpin in the center, and then the more better known Black radical movements of the late 60s and the rise of the Chicano movement. And that was going to be chronological. Mike had a clear outline of exactly what should be covered in that. And then I got the assignment of writing about the other movements. That's the women's movement, the anti-war movement, the gay movement, the Asian American movement, the counterculture, the free clinic, the underground press, KPFK radio. So it was kind of a logical division of labor, and we exchanged chapters, and he did, I must say, more rewriting of my chapters than I did of his chapters. He has a very distinctive writing style. My biggest worry, I can admit this now that the book is out, was that it would be clear that there were two different writing styles in this book. But because of the mutual rewriting, especially his work on the beginnings of my chapters, nobody has complained about this. I was worried that it's going to seem like there's this very dark, gripping history of people of color in LA. And then there's these other kind of cheerful, happy chapters. The women, they make progress, gays, victories. But nobody has noticed that. So I'm very grateful that we haven't run into that problem. But so that was the conception. That's the way we did it. We got slowed down in the middle of this because Mike got two kinds of cancer He's been treated and recovered from both of them, and he's totally healthy now. So the book took a couple of years longer than we had originally planned. And also, it's 800 pages, which some people think is too long. We think it's too short. We think we left out a lot that we wish were there. But, you know, we're kind of testing the limits of binding technology. Although there are longer books, I've been working on Reaganland by Rick Perlstein. I'm sure that's a book for sale at Chevalier's, and that's like a 1,200-page book, not an 800-page book. So we got nothing compared to Rick Perlstein. But anyway, that's where the book came from. That's how it got organized, and that's how we ended up with 800 pages.
Cool. So you have 800 pages. So what did you leave out?
Well,
so we'll go to look. I blame you for that.
What did we leave out? You know, we are full of regret about all the things we left out. We left out, I did a lot of work on a chapter on communes, on communal living in LA. In fact,
Right, yeah.
I don't know if Bert knows this. There was a commune of left-wing lawyers called a Bar Sinister, and they lived together, 7 couples with their little kids. And this went on for many years. And then they defended radicals who got in trouble with federal prosecutors. Did a lot of work on that chapter. We don't have the chapter on communes and radical lawyers. We should have written a chapter on GI organizing. Camp Pendleton is just down the road. This was a big thing in LA. There was a Teamster Wildcat strike that was quite a big deal that Mike Davis was actually part of. He was working as a truck driver for part of these years. We really should have had a chapter on that. I wanted to write, and I did write, a chapter on activism, anti-war activism by artists. There was the Artist Peace Tower on Sunset Strip was an international monument to the anti-war movement. The biggest artists in New York and some in Europe all sent in work, and it was all displayed. It was attacked every night by right-wing supporters of the war. Quite a fascinating story. That got cut. No art, no radicalism by artists.
It sounds like most of your writing got cut.
Well, we see, that's an interesting point. It's an interesting point. The thing was, we had to have this core backbone. We couldn't, you know, we're not going to cut the Black Panthers. We're not going to cut the school integration. You know, that's got to be there. But this, you know, actually the GI chapter would have, the Teamster Wildcat was Mike's story. The GI organizing, he would have written to, but thank you for noticing.
Well, one of the things that's in the book that's really fantastic are the images. And so you talk a little bit about, you know, and you talk a lot actually about art there. You talk about the Watts Renaissance, you talk about other kinds of, you know, art that took place, musical, you know, in terms of music, jazz, and folk music, etc., the blues. So there is a lot of art in the book. How did you decide what kinds of images to use?
Well, the Watts Renaissance is part of this trajectory because we think of, I mean, the kind of ordinary view of the Watts riots is, oh, they burned down Watts, you know, how terrible for the people who live there. But actually, after the Watts Rebellion ended, there was a tremendous flowering both of new kind of organized radical politics and of the arts. And so there was avant-garde jazz, Horace Tapscott and the Pan-African Orchestra. And then there was this huge flowering of, especially of sculpture, assemblage, kind of a fancy French word, but really it was Noah Purifoy and his peers making art out of debris from the riots that they picked up in the streets. I mean, you know this well. LACMA had a show this a couple of years ago. This is like now priceless treasures. So that's an essential part of the story that we didn't want to leave out in one of the more surprising chapters too, I think.
Yeah. So as I said, I'm very, very impressed. My book is more about looks a great deal at gender, and you cover a lot of gender issues in your book. So what was the most surprising, if anything, with regard to gender that you came across in looking at these protest movements and how they were organized and how they played out?
Well, we think of the 60s movements as very male. They were fighters. They were confronting, the man. But we found, one of the most interesting chapters to me was about Women's Strike for Peace. This was a anti-war movement that was there before anybody else. Starting in 1961, this group had a protest march of 2,000 women downtown LA protesting against nuclear testing. This was the days when there was atmospheric testing in Nevada, and when the wind shifted, radioactive iodine fell out of the clouds. The cows ate the grass that had been watered with the radioactive iodine so that the milk was radioactive. And so the women said, as women, we demand an end to this testing that is ending up poisoning our children. They claimed their status as good mothers. Of course, they were called communists and said they were under the control of Moscow and so on. But unlike most of the other male-led left-wing organizations, they didn't take that charge very seriously. They said, well, we have a lot of volunteers in our organization and we don't examine their political paths, and maybe some of them are communists, but that doesn't bother us. They're welcome to join our protest. This was really an eye-opening response to McCarthyism. A lot of people were terrified by McCarthyism. They just sort of shrugged it off, even when they were subpoenaed by HUAC. So Women's Strike for Peace, led by a remarkable woman named Mary Clark, then became a leading anti-war organization once Vietnam rose to the forefront. They sent the first delegation to Hanoi. They met with women from North Vietnam and from the Viet Cong. Quite heroic, quite important. There was also, we also have a fascinating chapter to me on the battle within the Catholic Church over radical reform. Now, we kind of have this idea that, well, there was Vatican II proclaimed by the Pope. There were the Berrigan brothers who were anti-war militants. But this all was also fought out in LA, which had the most conservative church hierarchy. And it all focused on one nun who happened to be a silkscreen artist, Sister Corita. I've gotten more email about Sister Corita from people who read our book than any other chapter. People say, I have a print of Sister Corita. Somebody said, I have 5 of Sister Corita's prints. People send me pictures of their Sister Corita prints. The hierarchy, which was, Irish male traditionalists, ordered her to stop making anti-war art. She found it very difficult to comply with that. They expelled her from her order. Most of her order went with her. It's kind of her ending is very sad, but it's an amazing story that you wouldn't think that a radical nun would be the focus of the biggest political confrontation in the Catholic Church, outside of the East Coast. So there's another surprising place that gender appears. And then, of course, Angela Davis, the most famous radical of the 60s. Should we talk about Angela Davis?
Please.
Well, actually, I want to talk a little bit about Angela Davis, but I want to talk a little bit about the difficulties that women, had within the movement. And so there's a great story that you have about Angela Davis and why she had to stop calling herself a Panther, okay? And then also I want to talk about this backstory that you talked about with regard to the Watts riots of this pregnant Black woman who had been raped by a policeman that the larger community the Black community knew about because that information just spreads like wildfire through an ethnic or racial community, but that the white community and the West Siders and all those folks did not know about. So, and because when you think about that, that's really similar to what happens with Latasha Harlins and her story. And so I want to kind of cross over into that territory, but
Sure.
please
Well,
talk a little bit, tell us a little bit about Angela Davis and where she was in terms of the Black Power movement and this kind of, I guess, conflict between organizations and who can claim to be this versus that, because that's always part of a movement.
Well, the surprising thing about Angela is she never set out to become the most famous radical of the 60s. A lot of other people did, including a lot of the Panthers. I mean, if you look at Stokely or Eldridge Cleaver or, you know, Huey Newton, Angela was hired at UCLA as an assistant professor of philosophy. She'd studied with Herbert Marcuse. She was just going to be an assistant professor at UCLA. At the time, she was also a member of the Communist Party of Southern California, the Che Lumumba Caucus, which was actually quite a wonderful group of very talented and brilliant young Black people. But Angela got outed as a member of the Communist Party by an undercover agent who wrote a letter to the Daily Bruin. And so she became a public celebrity when the Regents fired her, sort of against her will. This was never her idea to do this. But then, of course, the faculty, liberals, there had been a McCarthyism in the University of California in the early 50s. A lot of those people, veterans, were still around, and they said, we're not going to stand for this. So there was the first chapter of Angela Davis is fighting her firing by the Regents, which of course was successful because you can't fire a person for their political beliefs at the University of California anymore. She then joined the Panthers. The Panthers, in the meantime, lots of people claimed to be Black Panthers. There was a Black Panther Party in Alabama, which was militant and very inspiring. And they had admirers all over the place who called themselves Black Panthers. But there's also this group in Oakland of Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and Eldridge Cleaver. And they said, we're the real Panthers. And they kind of let it be known in Los Angeles that if you're not part of our organization, you're not a Panther. So I think Angela's first loyalty pretty much always was to the Che Lumumba Caucus. Those were her people.
And to Black Power in general, just as a philosophy, the notion of Black Power was something that she was very interested in, engaged with.
Yes, yes. And then again, something that she never intended to happen, that she had nothing to do with, but this young kid, Jonathan Jackson, who was, the younger brother of a person who was in jail, who she was close to, had this suicidal mission to break his brother out of the courthouse in Marin County, and everybody was killed. And it turned out Angela had bought the guns and registered them in her own name that were used in this. She had no idea this is what was going to happen. That was certainly never her plan. But then she became charged with the murders, and she went underground and became America's most wanted person. So Angela's whole career is unwanted leadership and face on the cover of every newspaper and magazine in the world. And she actually was able to do it. It turns out she's quite eloquent. She's got a great strategic mind. She was found not guilty by a jury of her peers, which had no trouble coming to this conclusion. And she's recently retired from UC Santa Cruz as a professor at the University of California.
That's right. But so women are kind of important in that role because they take on the imagination whether positive or negative, of those people who are, observing um, revolution or rebellion or insurrection or riot. But they also are important because they can serve as the catalyst. And I think in both of our books, we talk about this notion of manhood, Black manhood, that is associated with protection of women and children. Okay, and so you talk about in your book, particularly this rape victim, and how people really see that this is beyond the pale in terms of what the police have done and the kind of oppression and surveillance and abuse by the LAPD. And so, and for me, it's Latasha Harlins and this sentencing, which seemed to defy what people thought was justice as well. And both of these sort of stand as one of the quote unquote catalysts, as talk about that word within your book. But it's not like a lot of people knew about it initially.
Well, the rape that LAPD officers raped a Black woman, and this just shows how separate Black LA and Black LA media were from the mainstream, the rest of LA. It's because there were Black newspapers, the Sentinel, the Eagle, had talented investigative reporters who wrote about this. So this was very well documented, very well known, very outrageous, never appeared in the LA Times or the what was it called, the Herald Examiner.
Right.
And Watts was this huge surprise to white Los Angeles and white America. The Watts rebellion broke out just a week after Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the most important civil rights legislation of the century, since the 14th Amendment was ratified, really. So the kind of general attitude was, well, the Black people have won. So, what are they complaining about here? But of course, what was happening in LA was quite different from what was happening in Mississippi and Alabama and, Georgia and South Carolina. They had the right to vote, but they had this police department that was incredibly violent, incredibly racist, and impossible to control. And the incident that provoked the Watts riots, the arrest on drunk driving of the Fry brothers, they were called. This was a very small thing, but it got to be big in part because people had personally experienced the LAPD and because there was this outrageous event before it. And this is a little bit like Latasha Harlins and Rodney King. The big difference, of course, is that in the Latasha Harlins and Rodney King case that you're talking about, there's two parts to it. Can we talk about this now? There's two parts to this. The Rodney King part is the oldest story in America.
Right.
A group of white men beat up a Black man, nearly kill him. The Latasha Harlins case, which happened pretty much simultaneously, a little bit after, is something really different. It involves a Black woman who's attacked not by a Black woman, not a Black man, attacked not by the police, but shot in the back of the head and killed by a Korean woman, another woman, and then put on trial. And the killer is basically not given a jail term by another woman, a Jewish woman judge. So this is a story about a Black teenager, a Korean woman shop owner, and a Jewish judge. It's completely different from the story of the gang of white men attacking the Black man. And that's what makes this such a fascinating book.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I decided to write the book. And I hadn't decided to write the book at all. I had just moved to LA in 1991 when, 1990, right? 91. When this happened, I was living in Westwood and this happened, and a young assistant professor at UCLA, and interested in women's history, but working mostly on the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And it's just every time I turned on my television, there was something happening. First was Rodney King, and then it was Latasha Harlins. And I was coming from the University of Texas in Austin, and I grew up in segregated Virginia. So I thought coming to LA would mean, okay, there would be no more race issues like the issues that I had, been a part of. I'd gone to school in the Northeast, and that was the kind of racism there that I was used to too. But, LA was a different kettle of fish because of its diversity and had a Black mayor and all these other kinds of things. And so this just kind of leapt out of the television at me that the major players in this case were all female. They were all females of a different generation, of a different racial ethnic background and class background as well. Which is why I decided to write the book.
And, the great injustice of this was the verdict, not the verdict. Not the verdict. The verdict was guilty of voluntary manslaughter. It was the
Correct.
sentencing. And
Right.
that also makes it different because that meant there was one person, the judge became the focus of this. But because of that verdict, the Rodney King riots had a kind of target that really was missing in the Watts riots, namely the Korean stores of South LA. I knew that there were a lot of liquor stores in South Central that were owned by Korean and Korean American families. But your book shows, I mean, it's quite shocking. 2,300 Korean-owned shops were looted, damaged, or destroyed after that verdict by Judge Joyce Carlin. It's mind-boggling.
Well, the vast majority of the businesses in South Central at the time were owned by Korean Americans. And so, and not only that, but of course the looting and all of that left South Central and went straight to Koreatown. So that's why so many of the stores were looted. But it started in, a lot of people thinks that the insurrection, the riots started with the beating, that took place where everybody saw the truck driver, Reginald Denny, beaten. But indeed, it actually started in a liquor store about an hour before then. And it was a Korean liquor store, Korean-owned liquor store. And so that really does become the focus of it. And so, so she does become a catalyst for this. But I think what's important about her case is that it's really not the police that are the focus.
Yeah.
It is actually the larger criminal justice system. So it is, and we have seen this played out, and we see it played out since 1992 and up until today. Okay, when we oftentimes think about the police, because if you read your chapters on WAS, I mean, it is just incredible the amount of violence that we're talking about. Actually, before Watts, actually, and then after Watts and during Watts, the people are just mowed down really by the police with no consequences whatsoever for the people who do it. But when we look at today, I mean, we're talking not only when we look at Michael Brown, for example, we look at, Aubrey, or if we look at any of Breonna Taylor, we look at any of those cases today, we're not just talking about the police, we're also talking about the special prosecutors and the juries and, the judges. And, so it's the entire criminal justice system, I think, that is that people are responding to in what we see in the Black Lives Matter and other organizations. It's not just BLM, that's taking place now. And so that gets me back to the question about the arc of social justice movements or injustice within LA. Are we just playing this kind of cha-cha-cha where you go 3 steps forward and 3 steps back, or whatever? Are we actually moving along this trajectory that's going to get us out of this loop? It always seems to loop back around to the criminal justice system, and it's either the police or it's the sentencing that's unfair, or, you know, or sentencing that does not happen, or charges that are never brought. We're still waiting to see what's going to happen with Breonna Taylor, for example. We had this shooting last night that took place of this man. And so we'll to see what's going to happen with that. So are we just kind of stuck in this mode of, you know, build up of this great frustration and explosion, and then people talking about, you know, changing the system, and the system never changes, and then it goes on and happens again? Does LA show us anything that might indicate that there is an out, there's actually an exit off the 405 that's not so clogged and turns us back around again?
Yeah, that's what we all wish we knew the answer to that question. In
Exactly.
some ways, the underlying structural conditions that explain why Watts exploded in 1965 are still there.
Right.
The job situation is probably worse, more unemployment than there was in the 60s. The housing situation, we're in a housing disaster in Los Angeles.
Gentrification is number one on everybody's lips in terms of what's wrong with LA these days.
And you know, the schools are still a big problem in LA, and improving the schools. And police violence, you know, we have lots of horrible videos of the way the LAPD and the sheriffs conducted themselves in the last couple of months. But I have a big but. Maybe I'm a reckless optimist. Maybe I'm foolish here. But it seems to me that what Black Lives Matter has done in LA and everywhere else over this past summer is miles better than anything we had in the 60s. I'm old enough to consider myself part of the 60s. It's better organized. It's more focused. It's so much broader. There have been Black Lives Matter demonstrations everywhere in America. I mean, Newport Beach in the world. Newport Beach had hundreds of people marching along the boardwalk there, carrying signs that said Black Lives Matter. I mean, Newport Beach is the most Republican and the most upper class place in Southern California. And if they're saying Black Lives Matter in Newport Beach, something is really changing, I would like to think. So it's been bigger, it's been more focused, it's been better organized. Because of Black Lives Matter, the mayor changed his mind in Los Angeles from increasing the police budget by 6% to cutting $150 million. Now we say that's not enough, that's not a drop in the bucket. But before Memorial Day weekend, it was inconceivable that the mayor would call for cutting the police budget. So one of the big questions is how come Black Lives Matter is so much more successful than any of the previous movements were? How come this movement is so much more focused, how much more interracial, how much better? This takes me back to gender. Black Lives Matter, I believe it's fair to say, is led by women.
Well,
that was not the case. That was not the case for the Black Panthers or the classic civil rights movements of the 60s, certainly. So this is one thing I think may be a factor here. And the other thing is they've been around for a long time now. I mean, they've been around for, what, 6 or 7 years. So they know what they're doing, basically.
They do know what they're doing. I mean, I think that the female aspect to it is really, really big. And I'm really happy about that. And I'm glad that people are calling out the women and saying, these women put this together. They did the hashtag, they got it going. But I also think that's really what's important about Black Lives Matter is it is like some of the older civil rights movements or organizations. If you look at the NAACP, if you look at the Urban League, when they started, they were, much of it was, they were interracially driven as well. But also they didn't stop. That is, they continued to build organizationally over the decades. And so there were and still are NAACP, organizations in every major city, and some of the smaller cities too. Same for the Urban League. And that's what Black Lives Matter has done. It has continued the work 24/7, every day, period. They've got the statistics, they've got the people
on the ground. They know how to get in contact with, all of that. And the other thing too is that they are not exclusive. That is, they don't say that they should control the movement. Now, all of a sudden it comes under the big umbrella of Black Lives Matter. There are a lot of other organizations, and they're not saying, say it, Black Lives Matter. Okay, so the kind of turf wars that you were seeing in the 60s, for example, they're not having that. They are really a group that's allowing anyone who, you know, who's on the right side of the major agenda points to be a part of it, and all of that. So I think that they're doing a really fantastic job. The other thing that they've been able to is to make other people outside of the United States realize that there are injustices in their society, and that this should be a united effort just to end injustices, period. And so they've been able to get people in London, people in Paris, and people in, you know, all over the place in the Caribbean, and people in South America and in Australia, etc., all participating in some form or fashion of social justice protests associated with George Floyd, but also to say, well, this is also what's happening, and pushing the discourse about racial injustice, the ways in which immigrants are treated, the ways in which, you know, LGBTQIA are treated, et cetera, different ethnic groups, different racial groups, et cetera, in their particular society. So that's super important.
Can I interrupt to ask you guys to talk about two things in particular that struck me in the book? The first one was a shock to me about the Fair Housing Act repeal in '64. I couldn't believe that I was reading this about California. And the second, maybe on a more hopeful note, if you could talk about Tom Bradley and his rise and the coalition, and whether maybe we're seeing something like that coalition now, in part because of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Sure. This takes me back to the Voting Rights Act being signed by LBJ in 1965. And people said, well, why are the Black people in Los Angeles, why are the Negroes of Los Angeles so unhappy? They got voting rights. Less than a year before, California had a referendum on the ballot. There had been 3 years of nonviolent direct action, the kind of classic kind of put your body on the line and challenge injustice face to face to get integrated housing in Los Angeles. This was a very big movement that involved some movie stars. I mean, Paul Newman was on a picket line at a new white subdivision in Torrance, along with the rest of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. Big issue. They finally got the state legislature to pass a kind of open housing law that prohibited racial discrimination. And then there was a statewide initiative to repeal the open housing law that had passed the year before. And 2/3 of the white people of California voted to abolish the law prohibiting racial discrimination in housing. That came about, 8 or 9 months before the Watts Rebellion. So that's a very important part of the background, that 3 years of heroic, persistent, nonviolent, direct action was rejected. They tried. They succeeded in changing the state legislature. So that caused a tremendous turn away from peaceful protest and nonviolent organizing, to first to the explosion of Watts, and second of all to the rise of Black radicalism in the late 60s. Your second question, remind me?
About Tom Bradley and the West Side and his ascension and all of those.
Throughout this whole period, the mayor, Sam Yorty, was a notorious racist, in cahoots with the horrible LAPD under Chief Bill Parker the whole time. And the Black city councilman who had been a cop was being groomed by his allies in the Crenshaw district. Actually, he was not from Watts. He's from Crenshaw, which was an interracial neighborhood at the time. It was Japanese and Jewish and and black. In 1969, he ran a really magnificent grassroots campaign, which we have a big chapter about, which beat Yorty in the primary, but didn't get past the 50% threshold. So they had to face each other in a runoff, and Yorty ran an incredibly dirty racist campaign and stayed in office for another 4 years. And when Tom Bradley finally became LA's first black mayor, it was a great day in Los Angeles, but he'd run a completely different kind of campaigns, backed by downtown businessmen, professional campaign staff, and he devoted himself really to the redevelopment of downtown, the transformation of Bunker Hill with high rises, which did change all of Los Angeles, but he wasn't the kind of movement, and he never was able to gain control of the LAPD. So Tom Bradley's triumph was a turning point for LA politics, but it was not the one that the left had hoping for in 1969.
And the other thing too about Tom Bradley is that, of course, this coalition politics cost him a lot in terms of his attention to the African American community. And this has played out really in a very important way in terms of 1992, because with regard to Latasha Harlins in particular, he was on the wrong side of that. That is, he really wanted to make sure that just business went ahead no matter what. So he wanted to end the kinds of fighting that was taking place between Korean shopkeepers and Black customers. He asked his friend to come in and serve as Mrs. Dew's attorney. All these kinds of, he would not meet with the Harlins family. He didn't want to play hard or softball with Danny Bakewell. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on with regard to, I mean, you know, he was very much involved with KGRA, which is the Korean American Grocers Organization, but he, in terms of what the Black community and assuaging their fears that this was going to be something that actually he addressed and that he was going to make sure justice took place in, absolutely did not do that. And of course, as a result of 1992, he did not run again. And our Reiner lost his position, and there was a lot of fallout there, you know, from that. So coalition politics are really important, and we're seeing that play out now. But you've got to be other organizations too that I believe have to be willing to say, no, I can't really compromise on that. Got to go for this. And we're seeing some of that happening. We're seeing some of that happening now. We'll just have to see what happens. You know, the protests are back in the headlines because of what happened yesterday. But we still don't have the bill out of Congress, which is supposed to do something about policing. And, you know, so it still is, it's not sure what's going to happen with these kinds of initiatives. But we can always hope, continue to, you know, provide contacts and also to get out on the street and do something ourselves.
Well, maybe we should see if people have some questions, and while they're conjuring whether they'll raise their hand on the screen or use the chat function and have Kelsey read them, there's one other thing I hope we could talk about because of where I work in my real life, which is the Century City police riot, which I also found to be an incredible and amazing chapter. But people, please ask questions, raise your hand, or indicate on the chat that you would like to ask a question to these two wonderful people.
Yeah, this is the Century City police riot of 1967 is another one that a lot of people write to us about. Lyndon Johnson was preparing to run for re-election in 1968, and he decided to kick off his re-election campaign with a gala fundraiser in Los Angeles, the second biggest Democratic city in the country, at the fanciest new hotel, the Century Plaza Hotel, which had just been built in this new place, which had previously been the backlot of 20th Century Fox. And the Supremes were going to sing, and Jack Benny was going to jokes, and but the anti-war movement brought 10,000 people to protest the war in Vietnam. Muhammad Ali came to speak to the protest rally, and he had just been indicted for draft refusal for his unforgettable sentence, no Vietnamese ever called me the N-word.
Right.
When the protesters marched past the hotel, they were attacked by 1,000 members of the LAPD wearing riot gear and swinging billy clubs. The attack went on for over an hour. These were, mostly middle-class West Side white people, but some of them had brought their kids. These were, a lot of people wearing suits and ties. Women got dressed up because they were going to confront the president. It was a complete shock to Los Angeles. For the first time, thousands of white people experienced personally the way the LAPD had always treated Black people. Look at us the wrong way, you get clubbed, and we're not going to stop. It was the mayor, Sam Yorty, claimed this was a triumph over anarchy. But in the end, LBJ, I think, what could it have been like for LBJ that here in the most democratic city, second most democratic city in the United States, at his kickoff event, he's nearly evacuated by the Secret Service, which is terrified that they've got, quote, intelligence, that 10,000 middle-class white people are going to storm the Century Plaza Hotel. Ridiculous. I mean, they weren't going to storm the Century Plaza Hotel. But it was only a couple of months after that that Johnson decided to withdraw from the race, that if he couldn't campaign in Los Angeles, this was the beginning of the end of the Johnson presidency and his decision not to run for re-election. And today, Bert works in one of those high rises that was under construction that month.
And we're looking forward to the reopening of the Century Plaza Hotel as a
any day now.
6-star.
Any day now.
Kelsey, anybody have a question?
We do. We've got a question from Dan, and this is for Jon on the subject of women's protest groups. He's wondering if you talk about Another Mother for Peace in your book.
Only a little bit. Another Mother for Peace was another completely original idea. They put out it was a calendar. Is that what it was? I think they put out a calendar with wonderful graphics. Again, this was didn't come out of the organized left. It was not some, communist conspiracy. It was not some militant group. It was just a group of kind of, should we call them? Ordinary women, housewives of Los Angeles, that produced some of the most memorable graphic images of the anti-war movement. I imagine that there are people today in their 70s who still have their Another Mother for Peace logos around, hidden in some basement or attic drawer somewhere.
Anybody else?
The chat is empty, but we'll give it one last shot. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask their question live, you are more than welcome to.
I'll just add that during the 1992 event that I write about, there are two organizations that are pretty much female driven. And one of them, of course, is the Latasha Harlins Justice Committee that is organized and run by Denise Harlins, the late Denise Harlins, who was just going to make certain that her niece received justice. And so they picketed George Carlin's courtroom every Tuesday for years. They had many petitions to have her withdrawn, et cetera, et cetera. And then there was the Mothers in Action, which was kind of the female side of the Brotherhood Crusade. Again, these were women from the community who just kept this kind of nonviolent protest going for years and years and years. And so women are almost always either at the forefront or the backbone of these protest movements. And it's one of the things that I enjoyed so much about your book, Jon. I feel affirmed in some ways when I read your book and you talk about the women who are involved in various levels with what I've written in my book as well.
Bert, can I ask a question of Brenda about her book?
Please.
The amazing thing to me about this book, aside from just how thoughtful and smart and beautifully written, is that you are so fair-minded. You are actually open and thinking, instead of saying, you know, this is a black and white case of horrible injustice and violence and murder, and you're going to condemn the bad and praise the noble. You're unbelievably fair and sort of sympathetic to everybody involved. And I think that's tremendously admirable. Of course, it's what historians are supposed to do. You're not the prosecutor. You want to understand this, but I wonder how you did it and how hard was it for you?
Well, first of all, that's what pisses everybody off. Everybody feels like, because each group felt like I wasn't really true to their story. Okay, so I was, because I was too fair to this person, or you weren't true to me because you were, you know, you saw it this from this person's perspective. So it's really interesting because I tried really hard to just give three stories, but you know, everyone was angry about everything. So I'll start with you know, it was really interesting. And when I first wrote about this particular case, it was just for an article. I just decided I would do an essay on it and get it over with. And then time went by and I kept doing research and all of that. And I was trying to figure out, well, how do you do this? Because we're talking about 3 different groups. And I remember somebody said to me something like, well, are you going to write sort of like a deep biography of each person? And, you know, and then you learn Asian American history and learn Jewish American history. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. You know, I'm just, no, I, you know, I study slavery. That's where my deep roots are in terms of research. I'm not going to do all that. But at the end of the day, I realized I had to do that. And going along, I mean, everybody has a story. That's the thing. Nobody gets through this life without facing some bad stuff, you know, and it's either because of their gender or because of their class or because of their race or combination of those things or their size or something. Okay. And so, and I think that, you know, and we're talking about 3 different shades of humanity, period. And so I wanted people to see that. I wanted people to see, you know, if you were reading from the Korean American community, yeah, this is our experience. This is what we have to go through. This is blah, blah, blah. You know, if you from the Jewish American community, yeah, we had to, you know, we treated really badly when we arrived. We were racialized and, you know, we were pushed off into certain, and we were excluded from major universities and all these other kinds of things. And if you were African American, yeah, you know, we're trying to get out of Jim Crow and lynching and all that stuff to get there. So what's interesting is that all these people really are, you know, migrants to Los Angeles. These are three women who come to Los Angeles to live, and of course they're different classes and ages and all that other kind of stuff. But they get they do have the racial and the ethnic history on their backs. Period. They carry that with them. It's impossible to lose it. That's why we all end up, you know, thinking this or thinking that we shouldn't think, because we carry all of it with us. It's hard to erase. You can't blot it out, you know. And that's what I wanted people to see. Whether or not they want to blame someone at the end of the day is up to them, because, you know, you're intelligent readers. If you want to read a 400-page book, I hope you're an intelligent reader. You know? So you should be able to draw your own conclusions. You should be able to see the nuances. You should be able to, you know, to figure out what you think, what you feel deeply it was right and what was not right.
So
that's a good question.
Let me thank Jon and Brenda. Jon proving tonight that adage about if you remember the 60s, you weren't really there is untrue. And Brenda, whose book I didn't hold up before, the contested murder of Latasha Harlins. The 2 of these books together are so important. They're so well written, and they tell us what is true today in the city of Los Angeles and answers the question of how did we get here. So I urge you in the strongest terms to pick up copies of these books, particularly at Chevalier's Books. I know you can buy it online as well. And thank you all for being here, but particularly thank you, Professor Wiener. Thank you, Professor Stevenson. This was all that I hoped it would be and more. So thanks for
Thank you
doing
so
this.
much.
Thank you, Bert.
Thank you.
Brenda.
Bye-bye.
Bye.